Welcome to the Newsmakers Podcast. I'm Billy Hollowell, and this is a show where we go behind the headlines every day to bring you an interview with a pastor, entertainer, politician, or other notable news figure. And this is a show, again, it's daily, but it's based on our weekly TV show, which is also called Newsmakers. You can watch it on the CBN News channel and also on our YouTube page. And on this show, every day, we dive deep. It's a little more longer form with one of the people who you will often see on our Newsmakers show or across the CBN News platforms. On today's Newsmakers, we are telling an incredible story of a Jewish infant who survived in German-occupied Poland in 1942 in the midst of the Holocaust. It's an amazing story, and we're welcoming on Kirsten to share the details. It's all based on her new book. It's titled Irina's Gift, an epic World War II memoir of sisters, secrets, and survival. With no further ado, here is Karen to break it all down. You know, your family's story is absolutely incredible. Your mother survived World War II. She was an infant at the time, and there's so much to unpack here, and we'll get into the book that you've just written. But tell us a little bit about her story, her early journey as a baby during those uncertain times.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Billy. I really appreciate it. She was born inside this area that was known as the Warsaw ghetto, where over 450,000 Jewish people were walled in during World War II. And she only found this out when she was 32. She got a letter from a stranger who told her she had been born in the Warsaw ghetto and that she was smuggled out in a backpack.
Wow.
And that the parents who raised her weren't actually her parents. And the letter also said that her mother was murdered when she was around 1 year old, and that later she was rescued by a notorious SS officer. And she kept all of that secret from me. And when I was 13 years old, I discovered that the grandparents I adored weren't actually my grandparents. So she not only survived a war, it was only when she was 32 that she really started to learn about what had really happened to her.
Wow. I mean, what an insane story. And going back to, her mother and her as a baby, obviously at 1 year old, losing her mother. How did she survive beyond there? Because I know at one point she was essentially, they were hiding in an attic, essentially. A lot of people in a situation like that, a baby, the most innocent, they would lose their lives as well. How did she end up surviving that?
It was miraculous. We'll never know why. There were other women killed who were hiding in that house, and my mother was left behind. The Nazis didn't shoot her. But she ended up, the woman who I thought was my grandmother was actually my mother's aunt. And she looked different from me. She didn't have as dark hair, and she was able to blend in with the Polish, mostly blonde-haired population. And she was running around Poland trying to outfox the Nazis on false papers. And so she offered to take my mother, while my mother's father joined the underground to avenge his wife's death and to fight for his country. And eventually, they all ended up, the people I thought were my grandparents and my mother's father were arrested by the Nazis and sent to this horrible, notorious prison. And out of 500 resistance members who were tortured there, only 10 survived, and my grandfather was the only Jewish one. And meanwhile, another miracle, my mother was left behind when they were arrested. And eventually she ended up in a convent, and she was hidden by these amazing Catholic sisters. And the sister who raised my mother, Sister Cornelia, hid my mother in her bedroom. And that's where she spent the rest of the war.
Wow. I mean, how did it affect your mother? And obviously, she held it as a secret, but how did it affect her finding out these secrets about her life? And then we'll get into forgiveness because that's a big part here. But how did she deal with that? I mean, it's pretty shocking information.
Well, it was shocking, but to her, it was a huge relief. She described it to me as it was like a barbell had lifted off her shoulders because she always believed she didn't belong to her parents, that the people she thought were her parents, she thought that they had collected the wrong child after the war. She was extracted from Poland and they were in Germany recovering from the concentration camps. The woman I thought was my grandmother, her name was Alicia. She was in Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, and her husband was sent from Auschwitz to Dachau. So they had experienced just horrible, horrible traumas. And so they adopted my mother and took them with her to Australia, which is where I grew up. And that's where they landed as refugees. And my mother said, so she was raised by these really damaged parents who were trying to wall in everything that had happened to them just to function. And they would shut down her nightmares. She used to have nightmares of men in uniform with guns and boots and hiding. She remembered hiding in dark rooms and violent situations, and they would just cut her memories off and tell her not to think about them. They also treated her differently. They adored her brother, and my mother said that they actually beat her. And so she grew up not feeling any physical affection at all. She just felt like she didn't belong.
Wow. Wow. And, you know, once you find that all out, that relief, in light of what you just said, it makes sense, right? You start to understand why the things were happening that were happening, right? What was behind that? You know, I would imagine it was pretty shocking for you once you started to learn the details of this. And obviously, you know, you've put this book together, Irina's Gift, an epic World War II memoir of sisters, secrets, and survival. I'm sure you discovered a lot more as you were putting the book together. What went through your heart and mind as you were discovering this family history?
Well, I was 13, so I was pretty young and I didn't really know how to process it. It felt really novel to me that I had this grandfather. So the man who wrote the letter to my mother was her biological father, and he lived in Canada. And this is the ridiculous thing about this story is that they, my mother was lied to, and then she literally lied to me because after the letter arrived, we actually went to Canada to meet this man. And I was told to call him Uncle Dick, that he was this long lost relative. So when we found out a couple of years later, I had actually met Dick. And so it was kind of this novel situation that I had this extra grandfather. And my sister and I decided that we wouldn't tell our grandparents because we didn't want them to think we loved them any less. And so we waited, it was around 6 to 12 months before we actually told them that we knew.
Wow. Wow.
So we kept it secret from them.
I mean, it's a lot of secrets, right? I mean, one secret always breeds another secret. That's how it works. But you understand why, though, too, people were in these positions of trying to cope and deal with something very, very complex. And now your mother ends up becoming a Christian at some point. Talk a little bit about that because it's pivotal in many ways to how she dealt with forgiveness in this situation.
Absolutely. Well, the parents who raised her were atheist and Jews. So she had actually never been to a synagogue at all. And because of this feeling of not belonging and not feeling any physical love, she was invited to a friend of hers at 15 years old. She was invited to her house, this friend's house, and the family were Christian. And the mother gave my mother this all-encompassing hug. And my mother described it as this wonderful, she was a very buxom woman, and she remembers it as, she described it as this wonderful warm flesh all around me. And so this family treated my mother very differently from the atmosphere she had in her own home. She had lots of questions that her parents would shut down. They answered her questions, and they prayed around the dinner table. And so it was at one of those dinners that my mother accepted Jesus as her savior. But, you know, for all people who've dealt with trauma, for my mother, her journey her faith journey and her journey to forgiveness was long and complicated because she wasn't part of a church community. And she still went on, even after she was married and raised us, she continued to feel displaced and lonely and unwanted. And it wasn't until much later that through the Lord's Prayer, she wasn't able to forgive people. She was really angry, as is common with people who've suffered horrible traumas, and she battled with depression and anger. And she knew she had to forgive her parents, the people who had raised her so unkindly, but she wasn't really able to. And it wasn't until through the Lord's Prayer much later that she was able to understand that she had to she found the power to forgive her parents, and she even forgave her father for giving her away, and she even forgave the Gestapo officer who shot her mother and killed her mother.
Wow. I mean, that's the part, the forgiving of the people who raised you, that can be very difficult, but the forgiving of the Nazis and the people who murdered your mother and created all of this chaos, and death and destruction, that level of forgiveness, and then to go out and share that with others, that's pretty incredible. And I don't know how else you do that outside of the Christian faith. I think it's very hard for people to do that. How did that forgiveness impact her once she was able to get to a place where she could do that?
Well, my mother was a very loving person. Despite having grown up without this love, people would, I remember just a house full of people, particularly women, coming to our house. And I remember them basically talking with my mother for hours, people who needed help. So she was always helping other people. We always had people in our house staying over who had nowhere to stay, or particularly single women or people who'd been in abusive relationships. So she had a heart for people who felt unwanted and hurt as well. And so she spent most of her life, the rest of her life, basically ministering to other people, and she spoke in churches around the world. And it was later in life, shortly after I started uncovering what had happened to her, that she actually joined a messianic congregation called Celebrate Messiah that is affiliated in the US with Chosen People Ministries. And so she felt like she had come back to her roots, but she really came back to her roots when I took her back to Poland to meet the sisters who had saved her.
Wow. That must have been amazing. She went back, she met the sisters who saved her. I'd love to hear about that experience. And also, did she ever interact with any of the people who were responsible in any way for her mother's death and for what her family went through?
So she didn't meet people who were responsible, but one of the things in Irina's gift, and for me researching this story, because I encountered the worst of human behavior and the best of human behavior. For me, what was important to highlight in Irina's gift were the heroes, the everyday people who risked their lives despite all the hate and indifference swirling around them to save my mother. And so she met the house where her mother was shot. She met the granddaughter who was raised in that house by her grandmother, and that grandmother Maria had given shelter to my mother. So when I discovered this house, I wasn't going to take my mother there. And when we arrived in Poland, I told her about it. And again, that inner strength that she had, she said, I want to go. And so we met the granddaughter. We saw the place where her mother, my biological grandmother, was buried. The Ivana, the granddaughter, had put a large stone there, and on the Catholic High Holy Days, they would pray. She would pray for Irina's soul. Irina is my biological grandmother. So we met Ivana, and then I took my mother to see the sisters. And thank you to these wonderful Polish people who helped me find the sisters. That to my mother was so healing. And it was healing for me because that's where I realized her Christian faith had began. I'll tell you a story. My mother had remembered sitting for hours on these black benches with Sister Cornelia. And the sisters had a school that during the war was turned into an orphanage for 75 children. But my mother looked like me. She couldn't be in the orphanage. She had to be hidden in the room in Cornelia's bedroom. And my mother found these benches in the old school building, the orphanage. And the sisters told us those benches had been in the chapel during World War II when my mother was there. And then I learned how my mother would sit for hours praying with Sister Cornelia. And so when I saw my mother, we went into that chapel and the sisters prayed, and I saw my mother sitting in that chapel on a pew. I realized that is where her Christian faith began. She just didn't know it until she was 15.
Wow. Wow. I mean, you've put this book together, Irina's Gift, and you're here talking about this incredible story. At the end of the day, when people pick this book up, they read it, they get all the ins and the outs of what you're describing here, details we can't even get to in this interview. What are you hoping that they're thinking and feeling at the end of that?
I want people to focus on the heroes, the everyday heroes, because they're people like you and me. And we all have the power to do what they did. I wouldn't be talking to you today. I couldn't have written this book if a few people hadn't have shown kindness and empathy towards my mother instead of hate. The man who helped smuggle her out of the Warsaw ghetto and the sisters, they didn't see her necessarily as a Jewish child. They just saw her as a sick little girl, a sad, hungry child who was crying for her mother. And that kind of empathy and kindness has the power to bring us together in the divided nation that we live in today, but it also has the power to save lives.
Absolutely. And what an incredible journey. Karen, I so appreciate you joining me to break it all down and talk with us. The book is Irina's Gift, an epic World War II memoir of sisters, secrets, and survival. Appreciate your time today.
Billy, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
That's all for today's Newsmakers podcast. Be sure to tune in for the next episode of the show, and also head over to the CBN News YouTube channel and the CBN News channel to watch Newsmakers every week. We'll see you soon.